Thank you very much. I enjoyed both presentations a lot. Mr. Johnson, in the wake of the recent occurrence in the local elections that 3 major metros are now run by DA coalitions, what chances do you think there are that this phenomenon, the swing towards the DA on the part of many black people, black voters especially, can become more than an urban phenomenon? Because if I don't know whether I'm right in saying this, but I always had the impression that the growth of the MDC in Zimbabwe was mainly an urban phenomenon. But what you said earlier suggests that it's surpassed, the figures, the percentages you mentioned, 2 MDC supporters for every 1 ZANU-PF supporter suggests that at least it had support in some of the rural areas as well. Now, do you think there's any growth possibility in South Africa for DA support beyond the urban areas?
Well, first of all, about Zimbabwe, of course, the MDC would get just about all the votes in Matabele, okay, for essentially ethnic reasons, given what Mugabe had done there. So, those were rural votes for a start. But you're quite right. Look, ZANU-PF was rooted above all in Mashonaland, and there are Mashonaland East, Central, etc., so that there are about 3 Mashonaland provinces. And there they didn't have any, they couldn't get in. But elsewhere, it would depend, if they had a popular local person or something like that. But I think in South Africa, if you look rurally, I think that there are 2 things really which affect it. Or 3. One is, if you go into most rural areas, there's really not much except the ANC. There's not really an organised party presence of other parties very much. Secondly, clearly ethnic factors matter. At the moment, quite clearly, there's a particular Zulu following for the ANC, which is predominant, and where for example, if you look at those results, you'll see that in Maritzburg, the ANC vote went up. It's totally impervious to national trends. Quite clearly there's an ethnic thing going on there. Ethnicity matters, but secondly, or thirdly rather, chiefs. It's quite clear that the chiefs have been used, as the French call them, grand électeurs, where you do deals with them and then they try and shepherd their people into the voting booth in the way that you want. Now, that clearly works well in certainly large parts of the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. But of course the chieftaincy is not the same thing in all these areas. Zulu chieftaincy is much stronger than the chieftaincy you'll find in Botswana, for example. Much more powerful, much more able to deliver the vote. So that it's quite striking that, I don't think it's accidental, that if you look at the vote in the northwest, which is the main Tswana area, obviously Marikana was a particular case, but the EFF did quite well in the whole province, actually. It did as well in northwest as it did in Limpopo. Now, I can't help but think that's probably because the ANC is less able to use chieftaincy there than it would be in some other areas, So I think it's these sort of factors that matter, but certainly it's a very difficult situation for parties which are largely urban, and one shouldn't exaggerate. The DA did pick up extra black votes this time, but it's still a thin fringe, and they were, as I said before, they're more dependent on the EFF swiping a lot of ANC votes, really. But look, it's a challenge that parties definitely face. If they're going to move on from here, they've got to do something about it. But it's very difficult, because what are you going to do? You're going to go in and compete for the loyalty of the chiefs. They get paid by the government, and the government's putting through legislation to favour them in various ways. Nonetheless, it's worth pointing out that even so, the ANC vote did fall a bit in rural areas as well. So, I mean, there was a swing vote there, even despite the lack of an opposition party presence and so on. You know, it's not totally controlled vote.
Hoe ernstig is die ANC om vir die Khoi en die San se nageslag restitusie te gee?
Ja, al die vragen hoor, daarachter.
Because ek het was 'n expert getuienis vir die boere in 'n saak in die ou Suurveld, onderkant Gramstad. En die minister, dink ek, het dit geïnstigeer, want sy familie het ook daar aanspraak gemaak. En maar reg teen die einde het ek gesê, maar die Khoi en die San het 'n veel groter aanspraak as die Xhosa op hierdie grond. En dit het die ding 'n bietjie de mekaar gemaak, die regter het nie gesê aan hierdie grond moet gaan.
Ja, dit is 'n baie omstrede saak geweest. Daar het veral toe nou blyk dat die minister se naam op die lys is. Ek was hierdie jaar spreker by die Khoisan Volkskongres in Swellendam. En hulle het ook vir Tony Ehrenreich daar gehad. En die groot keuse wat hulle daar moes maak is of hulle meer kommersiële lyn wil volg in hulle grondaansprake en of hulle meer populistiese lyn wil volg. En ek moet sê, die stakowerheid, die koning in sy raad, hulle het op een ou na baie meer die kommersiële lyn probeer loop. Maar daar was al die in die Noord-Kaap het, wat meer populistiese aanslag gehad het. En Tony se bestaan daar in 'n baie sagte op hulle oor geval. Die ANC self sit regtig in 'n dilemma met die Khoisan. Daar was hierdie aanspraak op eerste nasie status en dieselfde disposisie waar ons in hierdie tipe van kongresse sit met swart eisers. Dieselfde disposisie sit die swart gemeenskappe met eisers van die Khoisan.
Was dat wel 'n uitspraak oor die Suurveld-saak, die Salem-saak?
Dis onder appel, nie?
Ja, maar dit is al 2-3 jaar omtrent.
Dis reg, want dit is ook 'n eis wat spruit uit. Iets wat gebeur het voor 1913. En aanvanklik het daardie regter gesê, hy gaan die 1913 afsnitdatum ignoreer. Nou, Agriesa het homself ook gevoeg as 'n party vir daai saak, en sê, jy weet, dis nou 'n skryende onreg teenoor die grondwet eintlik wat 2013 vasbied. En die argument op die stadium is, selfs al is mense van hulle grond afgesit voor 1913, het hulle nasate nog sekere gebruiksregte uitgeoefen na 1913. Het sy as werkers of as bywoners, plaasplakkers en so. regtig uit te presteer onder die wêreld se landbouers, dan is daai potensiaal opgesluit in die ou tuislande. En dan natuurlik Mangaung wat allerweer 'n waterskeiding was in die grondhervormingsdebat. Jy sien daar Mangaung en die druk op 'n tyd so opgebou tussen 'n groep wat radikale grondhervorming voorstel en 'n groep wat sê maar grondhervorming is nie die grootste prioriteit nie. Dis byvoorbeeld 'n mindere prioriteit teenoor werkskepping in die landelike gebiede. Grondhervorming gaan nie armoede en honger uitwis. Dit kan 'n uitwis oor geslagte, maar nie nou nie. Wat ons nou nodig is werkskepping, vaardigheidsoordrag. Maar aan die einde van die Mangaung-beraad het president Zuma het baie duidelik gemaak dat hy 'n spesiale meganisme gaan moet aanwend om deur uit hierdie doodloopstraat uit te breek. En ons het begin om ons harte vaste. Ons het geweet hier sien die onteieningswet op pad. Ons was doodbang dat hierdie onteieningswet weer kan lyk soos die ene wat Dr. Lisa in 2008 voorgestel het. Hoe grondhervorming werk? Baie eenvoudig eintlik. Daar is 4 programme waarom grondhervorming geïmplementeer word. Die eerste program is restituisie. Mense wat onder apartheid of as gevolg van apartheidswetgewing hulle grond verloor het na 1913, kan dit terugeis van die regering, die staat. Die staat koop daardie gronde by die huidige grondeienaars en gee dit dan terug. Dit beteken of die voorwaarde daarvoor is dat dit moes na die 1913 gebeur het. Dit moes deur die staat gedoen gewees het. En daar moet 'n aanduiding wees dat daar 'n direkte verband is tussen die huidige begunstigdes of die huidige eisers en die mense wat in daai tyd dit verloor het. So jy moes of 'n familieband gehad het of jy moes deel gewees het van daai gemeenskap of so. Restituisie het voorrang. As daar 'n moontlike transaksie is in een van die ander bene van grondhervorming, maar daar's ook 'n restituisie eis op, dan mag die ander bene nie toegepas word. Die tweede been is die herverdelingsprogram. Dit is waar 'n swart individu of 'n gesin graag wil doen in hulle plaas hê. En dan help die regering hulle om daai plaas te koop. En daar is verskeie programme hier, die ou SLAC-program, die hier is skare waarna ek verwys het van die dan kom daar is ook later Kaura. Op die oomblik is daar Plas, die Proactive Land Acquisition Strategy. En as boere hou ons baie meer van hierdie program as van restituisie, want hier werk jy met mense wat ernstig is om te boer. Dit moet gewoonlik 'n kommersiële ambisie, nie net plase weet omskakel na kommunale gebiede nie. Dan sal natuurlik die verblyfregsekerheidprogram maak dat die gesin of individu wat op jou plaas woon nie net afdaag nie, jy kan 2 jaar tronk toe gaan as jy dit doen. Veral as so 'n persoon ouer as 60 jaar oud is en dan so 'n persoon langer as 10 jaar op die grond is, dan is dit byna onmoontlik om van so 'n persoon van die grond ontslae te raak. En so 'n persoon het dan natuurlik ook regte wat niks te doen het met eiendomsreg nie. Hy mag ook verbou, hy mag ekonomiese aktiwiteit bedryf en baie dikwels bots dit met jou aktiwiteit op die plaas. Kan almal daar agter my nog hoor? Ja. Dit is iets wat ek gesê het. In restituisie betaal die staat. In herverdeling betaal die staat 'n gedeelte. Onder verblyfregsekerheid word hier niks betaal. En dan is daar die swart ekonomiese bemagtiging handves vir landbou, wat ook 'n grondhervormingsdimensie aan het. Maar, baie belangrik, reeds sedert Tina Joubert-Pieterse is daar besluit dat grond wat onder hierdie been oorgedra word, nie tel vir die 30% mikpunt vir grondhervorming wat ons al 2 jaar gelede moes bereik het. Nou baie belangrik, die staat wil nie markwaarde 'n grondhervorming betaal nie. Hulle wil nie markwaarde betaal nie. Daar is allerlei skemas om weg te skram van markwaarde af. Aanvanklik het hulle begin sê dat hulle betaal te veel vir die grond en hulle het baie dikwels te veel vir die grond betaal. Maar dit is altyd te gestoei om markwaarde bekleed te kry. En ek is eerlik onder die indruk dat dit gaan daaroor dat hier in die agterkop het hulle nog die idee dat die huidige patroon van grondbesit het op 'n onregverdige manier tot stand gekom, hulle dink ons het die grond gesteel. En hulle beloof dat hulle die grond gaan terugvat. En as jy markwaarde betaal vir die grond, dan kry jy nie die gevoel van, nou vat ek dit terug. Dan koop jy dit terug. Ons grondwet laat toe dat daar nie markwaarde betaal word nie. In artikel 25.3 is daar 6 elemente wat uitgesonder word, waar volgens die staat 'n afslag kan neem. Die geskiedenis van aankope van hierdie plaas, die staat se historiese belegging op die plaas, as jy byvoorbeeld droogte hulp gekry het of partyk was daar subsidies vir omheining, dan wil die staat nie nou weer betaal daarvoor, jy sê voorheen daarvoor betaal. En dit is vir elke boer die grootste bekommernis. Die meeste boere het nie 'n pensioenfonds nie. 'n Boer belê wat hy het in sy plaas, en as hy die dag aftree of verkoop het of sy seun, of hy verkoop het op die open mark, en dit is wat hy kom nie af te tree. En as daar nie markwaarde betaal word nie, veral in die afgelope tyd waar net 60% van 'n kommersiële waardeerder se aanbeveling uitbetaal word, dan beteken dit die koöperasie kry sy geld en die bank kry sy geld en die boer staat al geraak. Dit is die grootste vrees van boere op in die huidige bedrag van sake en grondhervorming. Boere sê die hele tyd, grondhervorming werk nie, maar die begunstigdes kry dit nie reg nie insgewende boere. Maar dit is nie relevant in die departement vir landelike ontwikkeling en grondsake. Hulle doel is nie om landbou te transformeer. Dit is die departement van landbou se verantwoordelikheid. Hulle doel is om hektare te skuif. En daar is nie die kapasiteit in die departement om grondhervorming te laat werk nie. Was onlangs in 'n portefeuljekomitee gesê dat met die huidige mensekapitaal in die departement is dit eintlik onmoontlik om grondhervorming en landbouontwikkeling as twee kante van dieselfde munt te bestuur. Die menslike kapitaal is eenvoudig nie daar nie. Ek moet vir sê, na 10 jaar van werk met hierdie departement, weet ek elke letter in die sin is waar. Mense word nie daar aangestel vir hulle vermoëns. Mense word juis in die departement aangestel vir 'n politieke en 'n ideologiese rede. Maar ek wil nie daar stil staan en oor dit saam het nie. Ek kan en ek voel daarna. Hoekom grondhervorming? Want die huidige besitpatroon is eintlik die fondasie van apartheid. Dit was die bestaansrede van die bevrydingsstryd. Nie net by ons nie, dieselfde in Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Angola. In 1913 is hierdie wet gepasseer op naturele grond. En dit het swart mense se reg om grond te besit buite die ou reservate van hulle af weggeneem. Met die 2013 herdenkings van daai wetgewing of merk van daai wetgewing, het ek by elkeen van die provinsiale kongresse gaan praat met ons die boere. Wat sê jy? Ek kan nie sê dat ek moes 'n mandaat kry van Agri-SA om presies wat om te sê, en ons het vir hulle gesê, dit wat daar gebeur het, was verkeerd. Ons gaan nie nou probeer beding vir 'n beter verlede nie. Dit was daai tyd verkeerd, en as hulle nou herhaal, dan sal dit nou weer verkeerd wees. Ek weet, die sosiale konteks, die ekonomiese konteks, die kulturele konteks, baie verskil. Maar die morele konteks is dieselfde. Dit wat in 1913 gebeur het, in die passering van daai wet, moes nie gebeur het nie. In 1936 is die wet op naturele trust en grondbesit gepasseer, en dit het ook besitreg in die ou reservate weggevat. En daarna toe nog die 1950 groepsgebiede wet. Dit het Suid-Afrika gelaat in die stewe grondbesitpatrone waarmee ons vandag sit. En belangrik, dis nie die vrye mark wat ons hier gebring het. Dis juist staatsingryping in die vrye mark wat ons hier gebring het. Wat belangrik is vir die debat onder boere vandag, daar is 'n groot deel, ek wil amper sê, verskeidelike meerderheid van boere wat sê, laat die vrye mark grondhervorming dryf. Dit is ook wat die stemmetjie in my hart van my sê. Waarom ek op het ek al geslaan? Omdat dit nie die mark is wat ons hier gebring het, kan ons nie net op die mark staat maak om ons uit hierdie doodloopstraat wat uitbreek nie. Hierdie boeredebat, ek kyk in my volgende lewe, gaan ek nie met boere werk nie. Elke boer is kaptein van sy eie skip. Dis 'n moeilike stuurbasis. Die boere sê, hoekom doen ons nie liewer grondhervorming op die kommunale gronde, die onherbinnende deel van ons land? Trouwens, met hierdie 1913 herdenkings was ek in die parlement, toe net voor my die Afrikanerbond hulle voorlegging gemaak het. Die voorstel van die Afrikanerbond het daai dag gesê, kommunale grondbesit is die vloek van Afrika. Dis wat Afrika terughou. Nee daarna, dus ek in die woord, en dit is veral Mandela Mandela wat vir my gerooi het, as wat ek is wat het gesê het. Dis asof hulle toe eers tot hulle sinne kom. En wat hoor hierdie mense? My kultuur, my diepste geestesgode is die vloek van Afrika. Kommunale grond kry ons in elkeen van die 54 lande van Afrika. Dit is deel van die werklikheid van Afrika. Ons moet praat oor hoe om dit produktief te kry, maar om te sê, dit moet nie daar wees nie. Dis dieselfde tipe ontkenning wat ons as Afrikaners vandag ervaar, wanneer hulle kan na ons geestesgoedere. Ons sal natuurlik die beskouwing dat die grondwet sal ons eiendomsreg beskerm. Dis nie waar nie. Grondwet gaan nie ons eiendomsreg beskerm nie. Daar is groot gate in hierdie vangnet en ons gaan dwaal. Grondwaardes, vrywillige verkopers en dan die geldigheid van eise, dit is waaroor boere ernstig spreek. Die kwessie oor markgedrewe grondhervorming het ek al reeds aangeraak en dan 'n vreeslike belangrike ding, die kwessie van toegang tot grafte. 72% van alle grondeise wat geslaag het geslaag op grond van die teenwoordigheid van grafte op die plase. Ons het probeer om 'n reëling te tref, ek het nou nog die mandaat na Agri Limpopo om hierdie reëling te dryf met die Raad van Kerke en Contralesa, die staanowerhede, te kyk of ons nie 'n sosiale pact tot stand kan bring oor toegang tot grafte. Dit gaan nie meer net oor swart mense wat op blanke plase graag by hulle grafte wil uitkom. Dis toenemend ook blanke families wat by hulle grafte wil uitkom, plase wat in swart besit is. Hoe herken ons die spore wat ons voorvaders getrap het, of wat ander se voorvaders getrap het oor hierdie grond? Nou is daar 'n groot debat oor landboufinansiering. Jy sien, dit gaan nie net oor die reg om te besit nie. Markwaarde is die fondasie van landboufinansiering. Elke boer in hierdie land gaan leen by 'n bank of 'n koöperasie geld vir sy volgende oes, en dit gaan oor die markwaarde van sy plaas. Want dit is die gronde waarop jy finansiering kry. As markwaarde vou, dan vou landboufinansiering. Daar's 3000 Suid-Afrikaanse boere wat elders in Afrika boer. Ek ken hulle nie almal nie, maar ek dink ek ken meer van hulle as die meeste ander mense. Ek ken een van my boere wat nie op grond van sy Suid-Afrikaanse plaas as kollateraal die geld leen waarmee in die Kongo of in Ethiopië of in Angola boer. En dan die groot kwessie oor of 'n ou net so ernstig boer op grond wat jy besit as grond waarop wat jy hier, grond waarop jy bly. Natuurlik ook Zimbabwe by elke Suid-Afrikaanse boer. Suid-Afrika is so klein, as Zimbabwe het nies, dan kry ons almal verkoop. Lesse van elders, daar is 64 lande in die wêreld besig met grondhervorming. 17 van hulle het restitusie eise en 11 van hulle maak daarvan dat hulle suksesvol is. Daar is gedwonge grondhervorming, teen markgedrewe grondhervorming, min of meer om die helfte. Japan, Taiwan, Korea, hulle het gewerk om die bemagtiging van die plaaswerker grond oorgedra aan mense wat daar gewerk het. meerdeels deur gedwonge grondhervorming. Brazilië, Mexico en Latijns-Amerika, hulle het revolusies gehad vir grondhervorming. Kenia, Mozambique, Zambië, hulle was grondhervorming deel van die kolonialisasieproses in Afrika. En dan natuurlijk Zimbabwe, ek gaan nie daar uitbrei, daar nie dit sien. Of ek nou in Boekenaap of in Tonga met boere gaan gesels oor grondhervorming, ek kry elke keer hierdie vraag, loop ons dieselfde pad as Zimbabwe? Nou my familie is nog daar, my familie het hulle grond verloor in Zimbabwe. En die sien normaal, as ek my neefs op mekaar, hulle dink ons is verskriklik naïef. Hulle sê, hulle het ook gedink, dit kan nie in hulle land gebeur nie. Hulle het ook gedink, daar is te veel buitelandse belegging in Zimbabwe. Ek glo, met elke sel in my lichaam, dat ons nie die pad loop nie. Want ons het iets wat Zimbabwe nooit gehad het. En dit is 'n voorbeeld hier op ons voorstel van hoe om dit nie te doen nie. En sê baie boere, ja, jou argument dra net water, as 'n meerderheid mense in Suid-Afrika die stem van redelikheid kan verstaan. My standpunt is, as meerderheid mense in hierdie land nie die stem van redelikheid kan verstaan nie, dan het ons nog nooit die toekoms in hierdie land gehad nie. Ons moet werk, asof ons absoluut oortuig is, dat die meerderheid mense in hierdie land die stem van redelikheid kan verstaan. Duitsland was baie suksesvol en Duitsland befonds ook 'n groot deel van waarmee ons op die oomblik besig is. Dit wat die suksesvolle lande in gemeen het, is dat hulle het geduldig is en politieke kapitaal gehad om grondhervorming te doen. Dames en here, nog nooit in die geskiedenis van die mensdom is daar suksesvol landbouontwikkeling gedoen, sonder dat daar langer termyn lenings beskikbaar was, teen minder as markverwante rentekoerse. Dis hoe eenvoudig soos dit. Dis hoekom ons 'n landboukrediet-raad gehad het, wat landbou gekry het waar vandag is in Suid-Afrika. Daar moet 'n verspreiding van risiko wees. Dit is nie net die staat se werk hier nie. Grondhervorming werk net as die privaat sektor en die boere self ook daarbey betrokke raak. Jy moet bekwame takgedrewe amptenary en 'n pasgemaakte voertuig, nie die staat self nie. En dan moet jy baie breë inkoop en betrokkenheid hê van alle belanghebbendes. Die Koranplan of hierdie nasionale ontwikkelingsplan, ek sien ek het net 1 minuut oor, so ek gaan nog net dit hanteer. In 2010 is die Nasionale Beplanningskommissie bekendgestel, professor Karani van Stellenbosch verteenwoordig landbou nie. Hy het onmiddellik gesê, omdat dit in die tyd was wat ons in die Deurloopstraat gesit het, kry vir my 'n voertuig waar al die landbouunies, ook die swart landbouunies, ook die kommunale landbouunies, selfs die Transvaalse landbouunie, kan saampraat oor die werkbaarheid van hierdie plan. Hulle hoef nie almal saam te stem, maar hulle kan saam praat oor die ding. Sy plan is dat 20% van plase in elke distrik, met ander woorde elke 5de plaas, oorgedra moet word. Plaaslike komitees, waar die banke en die koöperasies ook sit, moet besluit watter plase dit is en of dit geskik is. Die staat is bereid dat dit teen markwaarde geskied, wat vir ons 'n laaste loopgraaf is. Maar die staat betaal nie 50% daarvan. Die boere moet die ander 50% betaal. En dit maak jou vry van verdere verpligtinge teen grondhervorming of swart ekonomiese bemagtiging. Nou toe hierdie plan uitkom, was ek die eerste ou wat kwaad was daaroor. Ek het gesê, in watter soort demokrasie verwag jy van 'n individu om die rekening op te tel vir 'n nasionale verantwoordelikheid? Dit werk nie so. En daarom was daar 'n mandaat gegee by LGSA dat ons kan onderhandel oor hierdie ding. Ons het hier op Stellenbosch gesit vir 'n paar dae in die beplanningskommissie. Ons het gesê in plaas daarvan dat die boer 50% neersit daarvoor. Laat hom 50% aandele koop in hierdie plase. Dan is die risiko op sy nek ook. As hierdie ding nie werk nie, dan verloor die boere in die omgewing ook. En die beplanningskommissie het daarvoor geval. Op die dag wat Mandela dood is, professor Kraman gebel en gesê, kom ons implementeer so 'n projek. Kom ons ontwikkel die reëls van hierdie stel, soos wat ons speel. Kry 'n plaas, wat 'n boer bereid is om 50% voor neer te sit, en voor die verkiesing van 2014, 7de Mei daai jaar, dan maak ons hierdie ding werk. En genadiglik kry ek toe, Bosveld Citrus, om Land Talbot het gesê, hy sal die geld neersit. En die ding het gewerk, soos 'n droom, behalwe, die dag toe die staat moes betaal, toe sy hulle nie dan. Tot vandag toe het hulle nog nie hulle helfte betaal. En daarom het die banke, die koöperasies, Agri-SA begin sê, in plaas daarvan dat ons wag vir die staat om sy deel te betaal, hoekom gebruik ons nie die staat se 50% in 'n pool by Landbank om die rentekoers te subsidieer? As die staat 50% van die rentekoers sou dra, dan kan hy 20 keer meer grond koop elke jaar. En dan versprei ons die risiko ook na die banke en na die koöperasies, na die plaaslike boere self. En selfs die begunstigdes dra dan ook risiko. Die pad vorentoe is Agri-SA en die staat verstaan mekaar nou op hierdie punt dat markwaarde ons laaste loopgraaf is. Ons kan nie daarop bes gee. Hulle het ons 5 loodsprojekte toegelaat tussen nou Oktober en volgende jaar Maart in Limpopo onder hierdie nuwe reëls. Dat hulle sal die geld vooraf na Landbank toe oorbetaal, dan moet ons in vennootskappe gaan met begunstigdes. Langer wat ek vandag graag vir julle sê is, hierdie is nie 'n boereprobleem nie. Dit is nie 'n landbouprobleem nie. Dit is 'n probleem vir die totale ekonomie van Suid-Afrika. Want as ons toelaat dat markwaarde nie geld in gedwonge transaksies op grond nie, waar keer jy hierdie domino's as hulle begin val? Wat is volgende? Buitenstedelike gebiede, industriële gebiede, residensiële gebiede, dit gaan oor eiendom. Hierdie is 'n drukkoker waarop die stoom besig is om die pot se deksel te lig. Jy sien grondhervormings, oral in Afrika, die joker in die pad, as 'n regering betrap is met 'n swak hand. Ons is veral doodbenoud gegee wat gebeur het in Marikana, kort daarna in Dorings, en as ons sien wat nou op die universiteit aangaan. Ons het hierdie goed nie gesien kom, 2 jaar voor het gebeur het. Ons is doodbenoud dat die Marikana, die Dorings, die studente onder is, môre se plaas invallen word. En ons weet nie waar stop ons dit dan, en hoe stop ons dit dan. Daar is geen versekeringspolis om uit te neem teen radikale grondhervorming. Zimbabwese boere het die ding ook nie sien kom voordat dit hulle gebeur het. Zimbabwese boere stry vandag nog. Hulle verstaan nou nog wat die implikasies is van wat 16 jaar gelede daar gebeur het. Die belangrikste ding is, as hulle sou verstaan, wat sou hulle destyds anders gedoen het? Ons moet nou goed in plek skuif om te verseker dat ons vir 2 jaar, 5 jaar, of 10 jaar nog winsgewend volhoubaar kan doen. Om alles in toom te hou. En daar was hierdie verwagting van die Oos-Duitsers dat die 300.000 Sovjet-soldate moet help wat in Oos-Duitsland gestasioneer was. En met die 40ste verjaarsdagherdenking van die Oos-Duitse staat het Erich Honecker vir Gorbachev genooi as 'n spreker. En hy en sy kabinet was op hierdie landgoed met 'n kasteel waar hulle groot tafel gaan sit het om te luister na Gorbachev. Gorbachev het al reeds begin het met die groot veranderinge in die Sowjetunie. En hy het sy toespraak uit sy sak uitgehaal. En daar's foto's daarvan in die museum. En het opgevou, en toe opgevrommel en in sy sak teruggesit. En toe sê hy, history never forgives those who come too late. History never forgives those who come too late. En dis in daai konteks wat ek graag met julle wil gesels oor die nood aan verandering in die manier hoe ons na grondhervorming kyk en die uitkomste daarvan veral. Ek wil graag gesels oor hoe ons hier gekom het waar ons nou is, hoe grondhervorming werk, die waarom van grondhervorming en daarmee saam ook die debat daaroor tussen boere, die lesse van elders geleer in die wêreld, die sogenaamde Karamplan of die plan in hoofstuk 6 van die nasionale ontwikkelingsplan en die pad vorentoe daarmee. Hoe ons hier gekom het, is 'n storie van doodloopstrate. Die grondhervorming regtig erns begin in 1998. Toe is die minister van Landbou en Grondsake deur die Hanekom. En hy het 'n model gehad waar volgens hy destyds grondhervorming gedryf het. Dit is die sogenaamde ou slegplan of die hier 'n skare model. Jy sien in daardie tyd kon swart mense op staatsbehuising aanspraak maak met 'n toegif aanvanklik van R15.000, later R16.500 en dit het opgeskuif later tot by die R400.000, mits dit dan landbougrond was. En dis dieselfde model wat toegepas was op landbougrond. R16.000 per persoon, so as 'n plaas R1.6 miljoen kos, en die 100 mense nodig gehad as begunstigdes op 'n enkele plaas. En jy weet, almal se plaas is niemand se plaas nie, en hierdie slegplan het eintlik luisterheid in duie gestort. Ek kan nie vandag vir julle na een van hierdie plase neem wat in daai program oorgedra is tussen 1998 en 2004 wat 'n kommersiële sukses is. Daarna was Toko Louisa die minister van Landbou en Grondsake en in haar tyd het grondeise begin. Sy was eers implementeerder van die grondeise proses. Dit is 'n komplekse proses in terme van die staatsadministrasie daarvan, en as gevolg daarvan is alreeds in haar tyd baie omslagtige prosedures gewees wat gemaak het dat dit lank vat vir 'n grondeis om afgehandel te word en dit begin om kortpaaie te vat. Eerste kortpad wat gevat is hulle opgehou die navorsing te doen oor die geldigheid van eise. As daar vrywillige verkoper was, dan het hulle so 'n plaas oorgedra en dit het weer verwagtinge geskep by mense wat in ander eise soortgelyke aanspraak het wat waarskynlik dalk nie geldig is nie, dat hulle op 'n manier die grond moes kry. Nou, Toko Louisa se grondeise proses het eintlik al reeds die rooi ligte laat flikker vir die volhoubaarheid van die hele grondeise program. En daarna was Louis Moana ons minister en sy het in die skaakmaakposisie ingeskuif. Onder haar bestuur het ons op 'n punt gekom waar grondhervorming alweer ook in die media bevraagteken is terwyl ons sy volhoubaarheid. Na die einde van haar termyn toe was die Polokwane-beraad einde van 2007. En by Polokwane moes daar deurgebreek word uit hierdie doodloopstraat uit. Ek sal nooit vergeet nie, ek het 'n goeie kontak gehad daai tyd in die parlement en op die ANC se portefeulje komitee. En ek het hom gevra of ek vooraf die dokumentasie kan kry op grond waarvan hulle die besprekings voer in Polokwane. Polokwane is op so 'n klip gooi af van die plaas af. En hy stuur toe vir my 2 bundels met al die resolusies. Een bundel gaan oor ekonomiese resolusies en die ander een oor sosiale resolusies. Nadat ek 3 of 4 keer deur hierdie bundel gegaan het en ek kry niks oor grondhervorming nie, toe bel ek hom. Ek sê, praat jy nou nie oor grondhervorming? Hy sê vir ja, dis al op bladsy 186. Ek sê vir nie, was niks daarvan. Hy sê vir jy is in die verkeerde bundel. Jy kyk in die ekonomiese bundel. Grondhervorming is in die sosiale bundel. Ja, dit is my soos 'n punt is nie oorgegeef. Ek sê dit op die verkeerde bladsy. Ek dink soos 'n boer. Ek dink landbou het alles te doen met die ekonomie. Nee, niks daarmee te doen nie. Hier is 'n sosiale kwessie wat aangespreek is. En toe pas na daardie konferensie het ons die voormalige minister van Grondsake, Toko Louisa, toe by wat is die departement se naam? Sy werk toe met die onteieningswet, natuurlijk meer te doen uiteindelijk met landbou en grondsake as met haar nuwe departement. Sy kom toe met 'n eerste konsept van hoe onteiening gaan werk in 'n nuwe bedeling wat die blou duiwel ons uit laat skrik het. Ons het vooral geskrik vir die manier hoe die hofsieë in daai konsepwetgewing toegemaak is vir grondeienaars, hoe 'n solatium uitgelaat is. Dit het ons op 'n nuwe manier wat kyk na die grond. Ons intuïsie was dat die grondwet nooit so iets kan toelaat. Nou uiteindelik het die minister toegegee dat die konsep ongrondwetlik was, maar met al die regsopinies wat ons in 2008 gekry het, het ons besef, hier is plek vir 'n trekker om te draai binne die eiendomsklausule van die grondwet. Baie van ons het begin vra of die grondwet werklik die beskerming gaan bied, wat ons hoop hy sal bied, ook in terme van beleggings op ons plase. Maar dit het alweer veroorsaak dat toe ons in 2009 'n nuwe minister kry en landbou en grondsake van mekaar geskei word, wat ons verwelkom het, dat ons baie ernstig met hierdie nuwe minister gaan sit het, om te gesels oor hoe om uit hierdie doodloopstraat te kom. Dit was my voorreg om minister te ontmoet in 'n restaurantjie in Hielbrau op die land. En ek moet sê, ek was 'n baie gemoedelike mens, ervaar, wyse man, baie waardige man. En sy boodskap aan my was baie klinies. Ek het 'n politieke mandaat. Ek moet aflewer op daai mandaat. Ek moet sorg dat grondhervorming werk. Hy sê, jy verstaan baie min daarvan, want jy is nie in die kabinet soos ek nie. Hy sê, ek verstaan baie min van jou mandaat, want ek is nie boer nie. As daar iemand is wat 'n plan kan maak, dat ek my mandaat vervul sonder dat julle seer kry, dan is dit julle. Maak so 'n plan. Hy het my gesê, 'n boer maak 'n plan. Bring vir my daai plan. En ek is terug, Agriesa aan my algemene raad, en ek het hulle gesê, kerels, wat meer verwag ons van die ANC? Hulle maak vir ons hier 'n deur oop, sê, bring 'n plan. Kom ons maak daai plan. Ons het 'n buite die boks dink sessie gehou vir 3 dae. Ons het gesê, geen plan wat tafel toe kom. Hoor nie op die tafel nie. Kom ons kyk, wat kan werk? Nou ek moet sê, na 3 dae se debat, het ons nog niks wat vir almal aanvaarbaar was nie. Ons het nie die boks uitgegooi nie. Tot die mate dat 3 jaar later, in 2012, in hom genoem, toe die minister my in die oor vat en hy sê vir my, jy het my nie steek gelaat. Waar is daai plan? Sê ek vir hom, daar is baie planne, maar nie een daarvan het 'n breë algemene inkoop onder boere nie. Dames en here, onder boere in hierdie land, in verskillende provinsies, asof ons op verskillende planete boer. 'n Boer wat in die Vrystaat mielies plant, kan 'n R5 miljoen omset handhaaf met 4 groot masjiene en 5 operateurs. Vir 'n boer wat in Limpopo groente plant, selfde omset handhaaf, het jy 300 werkers nodig. En dis al baie min masjiene wat jy kan hier om die werk te doen. Ons dink verskillend oor arbeid. Ons dink verskillend oor die Zimbabweërs en die Mosambiekers wat toestroom in die landelike gebiede. En ons dink verskillend oor grondhervorming. Ek het meer grondeise op my plaas in Senie as wat daar in die totale Vrystaat is. So wanneer ek in die Vrystaat met mekaar gesels oor grondeise, dan praat ons altyd Afrikaans. Verstaan ons mekaar nie regtig nie. Ons beleef daarom die druk ook op verskillende maniere. Na minister Mpinti se aanbod het hy gefrustreerd geraak in 2011 en het sy groenskrif vir grondhervorming uitgelek. Uit daai groenskrif uit het hy 'n nasionale konferensie bymekaar genoem wat hy NAREG genoem het, National Reference Group, en hy het al belanghebendes in grondhervorming gekry om komitees op te deel en te praat oor 6 elemente van hierdie groenskrif. En dit gaan oor 3 nuwe strukture. Die een is 'n nasionale grondbestuurskommissie wat oorkoepelend moes kyk na grondhervorming, streek en distrikgrondkomitees wat op plaaslike vlak die goed moet implementeer, en hy het 'n waardeerder-generaal aangestel te kyk wat is die kwantum van vergoeding. Hy het ook nuwe grondprogramme bekendgestel. Die een is dat staatsgrond verhuur moet word, grondplafonne moet geld vir privaat besit, en dat daar geen verdere buitelandse besit toegelaat moet word. Hy het ook 'n komitee gehad wat ons werk aan gewysigde wetgewing, onder andere aan hoe kommunale gronde bestuur moet word, ook begin praat oor die heropening van grondeise wat vir ons die grootste moontlike nagmerrie was, en uiteraard 'n spesiale komitee om te gaan kyk na die produktiwiteit van kommunale gronde. Jy sien die kommunale gebiede in ons land is op die hoogste potensiaal gronde. As jy nou dink aan waar die uiteindslaan geleë is, die van die kusstreke, wat skei al op die oostelike deel van ons land tot die Noord-Transvaal. Dis die wonderlikste klimaat, dis die wonderlikste gronde. Dit is juist nie in die droër deel van ons land gesetel. En as daar potensiaal is vir landboere.
And I'm sorry to be speaking in English. I realise it's not part of the spirit of the occasion, but I'm not an Afrikaans speaker. The book which I wrote, which came out last year, How Long Will South Africa Survive, went to press in late 2014. So I'm trying to bring that up to date. I've got to actually do a new edition. But let me quickly just run over what the theses of the book were. First of all, I argued that the country, like indeed most of Africa, is now ruled by a bureaucratic bourgeoisie. That's the term brought in by René Dumont in 1962 in his book L'Afrique Noire et Mal Partie. We can see this in action all over Africa, that essentially both the top elite politically and the civil service below them all come from the same professions, often school teachers, public sector unions, and so forth. And that in practice, this class has devised all manner of rent-seeking techniques, plus, of course, a great deal of simple theft, because what it is engaged in, as Marx would of course predict, is the great task of primary accumulation. And this, of course, I think is a classic third world new middle class. And it's one of the reasons for the lack of accountability, because there is a sense in which it is assumed that black people getting richer is simply a good thing in itself, so that even if the means by which it's happened are not quite legitimate, this is smoothed over. Now, as a result of this has had a strongly repressive effect on economic growth, for all sorts of reasons. One is that affirmative action is undoubtedly a brake on growth. Secondly, BEE is another brake on growth. Thirdly, economic policy is used for a whole raft of non-economic purposes. I mean, over and over again, we see ministers come in and say, you know, we're going to big changes around here, and what they need is in the personnel of their department in order to get it demographically representative or something like that, you know. Aims like demographic representativity and so forth are often seen as more important than straightforward economic ones. Of course, there's then the bad management of state-owned enterprises and the high prices they charge. For example, airport charges and port charges are among the highest in the world. And finally, of course, there's huge wastage due to irregular expenditure. All of those things, and indeed sometimes straightforward bad policy, have had a dramatic effect on slowing down economic growth. And the result is that agriculture, manufacturing and mining have all lost ground. Even service industries are badly affected. For example, if you take our computer and information industry, which was really quite promising in the 1980s, largely due to defence expenditure, it's been very seriously handicapped since then by telecom and its slow connection speeds, slow internet speeds, and so forth. It's a serious problem. And of course, the fact that others are not allowed to compete. Now, it's not, in other words, that there is an attempt, a deliberate attempt to slow economic growth. It's the effect of all these other things happening. Now, one result of this, of course, is an increasing load of debt. We're often told it's 48–49% of GDP, but that's not really right, because if you count in the obligations to pay the deficits of state-owned enterprises, you'll find that it's actually around about 60. And the IMF thinks that for a middle-income developing country, anything over 50 is rather worrying. Now, This is roughly the situation that we face, and I argued in the book that this was gradually pushing South Africa towards a likely credit downgrade. That was quite a new argument when I made it, but we've heard a lot more since then. And of course that in turn would accelerate many of those processes, for it would worsen the economic situation, cause further flight of investment, higher unemployment and so forth. And that ultimately this would be likely to force some form of regime change, because I argue there is a sort of iron law in South African history that any prolonged investment strike will bring that about. Now I gave the example, the best recent example is 1985, the pull-out of loans by Chase Manhattan and then all the other major lenders, and the freezing of both domestic and foreign investment in 85 after the failed Rubicon speech, was really the cause of what happened in 1990 and the big change about what happened then. But it was like ringing up the money that was already in the till, or the lack of money, I suppose. Now, how has that set of theses stood up since then? Well, I would argue that my thesis about the nature and dominance of a bureaucratic bourgeoisie has been confirmed by several events since I wrote. Perhaps most strikingly, just as the book came out in the second quarter of 2015, we had, for the first time in a very long time, a quarter of negative economic growth. It's minus 1.3 in that quarter. And at the very same time, the civil service union got a wage settlement of plus 11.3. Now, if you can get plus 11.3 when the economy is going backwards, that is real power. And that used up the next 3 years of the contingency reserve, and was a very dramatic illustration of what I was talking about. Secondly, I think it's worth noticing that the virtual collapse of the National Union of Mine Workers in large parts of the mining industry and the expulsion of NUMSA from COSATU has left COSATU as the virtually exclusive preserve of public sector white-collar unions. And in other words, it's now more or less coterminous with that group. This is a very African situation where radical class warfare rhetoric about the poor and the homeless is used to win further privileges for an already privileged group. We have seen this all over Africa. And I would just add as a footnote here, by the way, that Nico Krüti, who I believe has had some attachment to this university, I think he's absolutely right to characterize the current student unrest, and I quote him, as a petty bourgeois attempt to gain privileged access to treasury resources. He points out that for all the rhetoric about decolonization, inequality, white privilege, and so on, quote, there is no mention by this new aspirant petty bourgeoisie, approximately 1 million in the university sector, about the 3 million 18 to 24-year-olds who are not in education, employment, or training, and for whom a far more deserving case of being black and poor can be made. If you grasp that fact, it makes entire sense that COSATU is supporting the students, because these are aspirant members of the same class that COSATU represents, likely future members of the civil service, if you like. What we're actually looking at is one aspirant group trying to get the privileges which the main group already has. And although the students may talk about Fanon and the rhetoric of students and workers and revolution and so forth, it's clear these are the would-be bourgeois revolutionaries, not proletarians. Their espousal of insourcing of university staff jobs is a further example of solidarity in achieving better pay and privileges for another section of public employees. Perfectly straightforward. Now, it makes complete sense that what Krüti refers to as the vocal active component of this movement clearly derives from the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, which for all its red caps and clothes and revolutionary rhetoric is also a petty bourgeois movement. Every petty bourgeois we know dreams of becoming a grand bourgeois. And the EFF's chief aim is to grab more resources for its leaders and their clientele. If it succeeded in all its sweeping plans for the nationalisation of industry, the resulting state-owned enterprises would all become further cases like South African Airways or the SABC, full of cadred employment, looting, nepotism, irregular expenditure, all requiring subsidies from the Treasury to stay alive. This would represent a sort of petty bourgeois heaven, where a whole new class of entrepreneurs would have a field day, thus imitating on a far larger canvas the business exploits of Julius Malema in Limpopo province under the premiership of Castle Matale, 2009 to 13. Now, the economy has continued to slow down. Again, more or less what I had suggested. In 2014, growth was 1.5%. This slowed to 1.3% last year. And in 2016, of course, we don't have the final figure yet, but the Treasury says 0.4, the IMF says 0.1. The main thing is that all three of those figures are well below the rate of population increase. So per capita income has been falling for the last 3 years, which is perhaps the real point. And the striking thing about this situation really is the lack of real government response. Effectively, the blame for the slowdown is laid on the fall in commodity prices or sometimes the drought, as it were, almost natural causes. Although many developing countries, including many in Africa, are growing much faster than South Africa. Belatedly, the government has begun to worry. I do find it quite strange how we get all sorts of headlines about heading off credit downgrade as if this is something to be done in the last month beforehand rather than in a year or 2 or 5 years before. But the only real response, if you look at it, by Gordon, has been to try to get fiscal consolidation to lower the budget deficit. And even now, the civil service wage settlements made quite a hole in that strategy. And of course, many state-owned enterprises continue to run on large losses, which have to be borne by the state. And despite promises to rein back in on such things as overseas travel by public servants, if you actually examine the figures, you see they're going up quite fast. Now, we are, in a sense, in the same situation that we were around about 1990. I remember my good friend Francel Slavic, who will be known to many of you, I'm sure. I saw him at that time and he said, you know, it's like we have a mantra being recited to us, because whichever way the country looked in the late 80s, whether it was to the EU, to the Americans, to whatever, Commonwealth, you've got the same thing, that you must do certain things. You must release the political prisoners. You must allow the exiles back. You must unban political parties, and you must have some all-in conference to discuss a democratic dispensation. And he said, well, everywhere the same demands come. Now, in a sense, we are in the same situation, because if you look at what the advice we've been getting for at least 5, even 10 years now, from the IMF, the World Bank, credit rating agencies, and so on, the OECD, they've all been saying the same thing. You must liberalise the labour law. You must do something about your state-owned enterprises. You may or may not want to privatise them, but you've got to stop them losing money one way or the other. You must do something about the civil service wage bill. You've probably got too many civil servants in number, but you're certainly paying them far more than you should. And that the wage bill is hugely disproportionate for a developing country of our size. And finally, and most fundamentally, you need comprehensive reform of the education system. Now, the point is that it would appear only by hints, we don't know definitely, but it sounds as if in discussions with the IMF and with the credit rating agencies that the government has suggested that it may be moving in some of these directions. And as we know, in his last budget, Pravin Gordhan did say there would be equity stakes in state-owned enterprises, but we've seen absolutely no action on any of these fronts. And of course the reason is perfectly obvious, that in every case you can go through, to reform education you would run into SATU immediately. To liberalise the labour laws you would be crippling COSATU and the Communist Party. And you can go on through each one of them would mean coming straight into collision with some powerful pressure group within the ANC. So this is why nothing happens. We've got what the French used to refer to as immobilism. That was the classic phrase from the 1930s and so forth in France. Nothing was allowed to move because everywhere there was a threatened pressure group. So in effect, we don't really seem to have a proper economic policy. In as much as we do, it seems to be rather like Mr. Pickwick. If you remember, he was saying, something will always turn up. And it's quite clear. I mean, what the government's economic policy is hoping that commodity prices will turn up. That would solve a lot of problems, wouldn't it? Now, why is it that there's this sloth and lack of direction? I would argue that what we've got is not, in the Marxist sense, a proper ruling class. Instead, we've got intense factional conflict. I won't go on about that, but we do have a sort of logjam of a situation within the ANC, and all sorts of cross-cutting groups which cancel one another out. It's not, of course, a stable situation. The students are trying to grab further resources at the moment, but so is the ever-clamant BEE lobby. And without doubt, public sector unions will be back for more fairly soon. It's no accident that the Reserve Bank has begun to be the target of criticism, for as the economy drags along slowly, the thought is bound to occur that after all, the Reserve Bank can, if need be, just print more money. That would be the answer, wouldn't it? Now, I think that this is likely to continue, this situation, even if a credit downgrade does take place. That is to say, if that happens, the logical thing to do would be to go to the IMF and say, look, we're in a hell of a mess, we need a loan and to help us get out over this situation and get out of it. But I'm pretty sure that the government will resist that as hard as possible if it happens, and it will be more like a ship dragging an anchor. It'll prefer to drag along the bottom rather than face the conditionalities which would come with an IMF loan. But of course, if that happens, and we continue with very slow growth, then the government will face the problem of these clamant groups, of which students are just one out of many, and this will generate political pressure to grab ever more widely at white-owned resources. But this is a cul-de-sac. We all know that, because if you start to do that, you'll only worsen the investment climate and make things worse for yourself. So there's no real way out in that direction. Now, if a credit downgrade does happen, there's no doubt that it will be an unmistakable public pronouncement that the ANC government has failed. And I think that although there will, of course, be attacks on capitalist credit agencies and so forth, there will be real political damage, and that could be some sort of decision point for political change. Of course, it would have considerable economic consequences, but it's very important to emphasize, and many sounds as I'm suggesting that we are going to just go the Zimbabwe route. I don't believe that, and not only for the reasons I gave in the book, but if I spent a lot of time in Zimbabwe in the past 20 years. Look, Mugabe tried to have a one-party state, both practically and then to legislate it. He crushed the Ndebele opposition immediately, and when there was a breakaway from ZANU, he crushed that. It wasn't until the NDC arose that a serious opposition was emerged even after 20 years. And then, as you know, he rigged elections, he used torture, murder, every other means possible. Now, I was doing opinion surveys throughout that period in Zimbabwe, and I can tell you that quite consistently between 2000 and 2008, I did a lot of surveys in that time, and my average would be something like MDC 61, ZANU-PF 24. I mean, those would be roughly figures. You know, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less, but never less than a 2-to-1 majority for the NDC. But that was not allowed to happen, as we know. Now, we, on the other hand, have a competitive electoral system which is pretty free. And we have not really had any great reason to complain about that. The ANC has hated losing the Western Cape and Cape Town to the DA, but it's happened over and over again. And now we have just seen other major cities fall. And those results have been respected. Now this, I think, is tremendously hopeful, and I think it's you know, one of the things which makes us pretty different. Now, of course, there will be some attempt to cheat. Already we've got these attempts to make cities ungovernable and so forth. And of course, it's quite true, as Grady Mantashe points out, that both Bulawayo and Harare are under MDC control. So, as he points out, it hasn't disturbed Mugabe's rule. But even so, I think at the moment it does seem at least possible that we could have electoral change in this country, and that puts us in a completely different category from Zimbabwe. Now, I think I'm running out of time. Shall I stop? Well, look, we're obviously nearing the end of the Zuma presidency. I differ from many commentators in that I see his presidency as part of a progression from the Mandela presidency and not as a radical departure from it. Corruption and the rise of the relationships which Italians have these lovely words, parentela and clientela, this is patronage bosses and the client class underneath. Those have already become features of life under Mandela, and of course the Armsville scandal took place under his presidency. Under Mbeki, those tendencies were further amplified, and they were by no means wholly resisted by the president. But where Mbeki drew the line, and I think this is the important thing, where Mbeki drew the line is that as he saw these great patronage bosses emerging, the mayors of major cities and provincial premiers who controlled huge numbers of jobs and contracts and so on, he didn't like this because they didn't fit into the democratic centralist vision he had. So, of course, the classic thing, he tried to exercise central control, and what he was proposing at Polokwane was all those posts be made directly appointed by the president in order to make sure he would have to be involved in anything else. Now that went down to defeat along with Mbeki. And I think at the time everyone was focusing on Zuma for Mbeki, but the defeat of that was very crucial. And what Zuma has done is simply to embrace that fact and to say, oh well, that's the world we live in, and he is comfortable with these large patronage bosses. And of course he made himself undislodgeable by putting in his people in key places. But the problem now that we've got is the inevitable sequel in which Frankenstein overtakes his creator, because the Premier League has become the dominating factor of political life, able to dictate the results of ANC conferences through their slates and block votes. And two of the key members of the Premier League, Ace Magashule of the Free State and David Mabuza from Mpumalanga, are now wanting to run for the top six. So the patronage bosses want to take over the leadership, as it were. In other words, whoever becomes the next president, and I think the logic of my argument is that it will be Zweli Mkhize, is going to face the already established power of the great patronage barons, and will doubtless owe his or her election to them to a considerable extent. And that in turn suggests it will be rather difficult for them to break the current logjam. So in other words, I think that we are still on course for regime change, and roughly one of the same means discussing in the book, though of course history is wonderfully complex and always has something new for us. Okay, I'll stop there. It's perfectly obvious that whoever succeeds Zuma, that one of the first things he or she will do is to try to get Malema back in. I think that it's problematic, this from several points of view. Look, it would obviously weaken the opposition if you went back in, because if you look at the municipal elections, really the DA gained just under 3% between the last municipals and now. Respectable, but not huge. The reason why there was such a big turnaround is that the EFF came in and took 8.2, and that meant that taking them together, that the ANC lost 11. So, that was really did the damage. So obviously, from that point of view, it would weaken the opposition if they did go back in, and for a start, of course, Joburg and Pretoria would revert to ANC rule. They're not the EU. I think that the problem is several-fold. First of all, the EFF has in effect displaced the SACP. It has become the key group to the left of the ANC, and there is clearly a room within our political culture for such a group. We had, as it were, a stunted revolution. We had 20, 30 years of revolutionary rhetoric, and then suddenly negotiated change. So all this revolutionary stuff was left hanging in midair. Now, what that means is that rhetorical and active tradition is available. Winnie Mandela tried to inherit it for a while. There have always been people. Peter McCarver did. Malema is just the latest of a number, who tries to inherit that tradition. And you can see, you can become a figure with some power if you do that. I think the problem is that he now has achieved that position. He's got his block of MPs. It's very difficult to believe that if he goes back into the ANC that he can equal that. I mean, what would his price be? He would presumably have to be A, in the cabinet, and B, have the premiership of Limpopo. At least. Look, in modern South Africa, you need a regional base. I mean, if you think of it, Zulu's have the Western Cape, Buthelezi had Natal, and so has Zuma. And Beki didn't have one, and you see what happened. So, he would want Limpopo, there's no doubt about that. But I think he would probably want more than the ANC would be willing to give, And the problem would also be that now that he's established himself as the leader to the left, he's not going to want to give that up. He's going to want to keep on talking to those groups and being their sort of iconic figure. And the rivalry with the SACP he's not going to just call that off. So, it's highly problematic, the idea of him coming back. And I think that already, you can see in these municipal cases, he's had great leverage. He's decided who's going to take power in the two biggest cities. Quite considerable kingmaker.
My question is, do you think Mr. Zuma can get to the point where he will disband the constitution and take over power? bearing in mind what's happening up in Africa, I was in Burundi last year, and that was before the problem started. Now the same thing is happening in the Congo, where the president says, I want to go for a third term, come hell or high water.
No, I don't see that as a danger, no. I mean, he has disregarded the Constitution, of course, to a degree, but even for that, he's got into a lot of trouble, not only with the Constitutional Court, but inside the ANC. And look, I think the big thing about the municipal elections is it's considerably weakened Zuma and weakened his ability to control the succession, so that he's in no political position to try something like that. I think he'll be glad just to finish his term and not have to shorten it.
Ek wil dit graag 'n vraagie vra na die landboukant. Dit het betrekking op die grondeise. Ons weet dat 1913 was die afsnydatum geweest en nou is daar weer 'n verlenging en daar is ook sprake van dat mense kan eise instel voor 1913. My vraag is net as historikus, in hoeverre kan ons staat maak op onderlinge tradisie om grondeise te regverdig? Of moet ons net kyk na skriftelike dokumentasie wat in die argiewe is?
Dit is nogal 'n sensitiewe kwessie in die departement. Die minister wil bitter graag die datum skuif na voor 1913.
Weet 1913 is die mees logiese datum om vas te pen. Voor 1913 was daar nie 'n regte datum, tensy jy terug gaan na 1652 toe, waar jy kan sê, dit is van hierdie oomblik dat mense benadeel is. En mense is nie benadeel in die term van dat hulle van titel ontsê is. Daar was nie daai titel. Die minister se grootste argument draai op die oomblik rondom die Khoi en San eise. Want die Khoi en San het nie na 1913 die grond verloor. Hierdie datum van 1913 is vasgepen in die Kodese onderhandelinge, staan aan die grondwet. So 'n grondwetwysiging is nodig om die datum te verskuif. In die praktyk is daar 'n groot klomp eise wat ingekom het na die heropening vanaf verlede jaar, vanaf 2014 denk ek. Wat eise is wat voor 1913 die oorsprong het. Op my eie plaas byvoorbeeld, ek het in die vorige grondeise proses net 7 eise op my plaas gehad, ek staan nou op 43. Kijk, 44 is beter as 1. As daar 1 was, dan skree jy 'n geveg wat jy moeilik kan wen. Maar hulle gaan nie my leeftijd uitsorteer, wat er van daai 42 geldig is nie. As 1 geldig is almal waarskynlik geldig. Nou, hoe so 'n proses werk tipies? Die ou stam wat daar gevestig was, die Litswalos, sy koning was Mashuti, is omtrent so 15 km van my plaas af. Die rede vir die eise gaan nie dat hulle sê hulle dit besit nie. Hulle sê hulle daar moet by mekaar gemaak en hulle het gejag in daardie omgewing. So al die plase in die omgewing is geëis. Nou Mashuti, hy het nie in die tronk gesterf nie. Hy is deur Paul Creer vrygelaat kort voordat hy gesterf is wel. Hy het verdwyn tussen Amanskraal en Guba's kloof op pad terug. Een van sy seuns het hom genaam. Hy het 6 seuns gehad. En toe hy nou nie terugkom nie, het al 6 hierdie seuns teen mekaar oorlog gevoer. Hulle nasate is vandag almal stamoorhede in eie reg. En hulle nie vir mekaar tot vandag. Daar's reedmaak medisyne wat oor en weer gesteel is en dies meer wat tot vandag kwessie is. Maar daai 6 is nie die probleem. Hy het 14 dogters gehad. En elkeen van daai 14 dogters het 'n ander stam ingetrou. En hulle dogters het 'n ander stam ingetrou. En hulle almal sê vandag, ons groot groetjie het nou by mekaar gemaak daar in daai omgewing. Daar moet ek sê, daar kan op jou einde 100 sulke moontlike eise wees. Dit raak onmoontlik om hierdie kraaidiens los te maak. Hoe lank kan 'n mens, hoe ver kan 'n mens die tyd probeer terugdraai as dit gaan by gebruik van grond?
Julle het gedink, die omgewing is moeilik. Goed, nog vrae? Ja, asseblief.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I just want to ask you, you focused a lot on what is happening politically and financially in South Africa. Do you think global issues will have an impact on South Africa in the near future? I'm thinking just simply of something like the American election.
Well, we're always affected by global issues one way or the other. We're too small an economy not to be. So, that, I mean, you have to be China or something, and even China would be affected if the American economy slows down. So, yes, I think we would be affected by the American election. And ironically, I look at the moment, it looks as if Clinton's going to win, but although in some ways Trump winning would seem like a disaster, it might turn out very well, because I think what you would find is that Trump would, first of all, if he wins, then presumably the Republicans will keep the Senate. If he loses, probably the latter. But there will be a Republican House of Representatives either way. But if he gets in, then pretty clearly he'll have both houses on his side, so that's quite a big advantage. And if you want to imagine what he's going to do, then I think the question is, where does he overlap with those Republicans in Congress? And pretty obviously, it's he wants a tax cut. They'll be delighted to vote for that. He wants America to walk tall and be strong, which means more defense spending. So they'll be delighted to vote for that. So those two things will happen. And he talks, of course, about getting a balanced budget and running down the debt. But it would seem to me it'll be exactly like Reagan. Reagan talked about balanced budgets too. And of course, if you cut taxes on the one hand and you increase spending on the other, you get a runaway deficit. And Reagan's attitude to that was, well, I never. You know, as if he wouldn't have never. And I don't know whether you remember that his director of the budget, David Stockman, he wrote a book about it, actually quite interesting. He said how he was always forced to draw a budget which balanced. Although they would say, assume 6% growth. Assume this and positive. And he said, you know, the most popular girl in Washington is Rosie's scenario. Because they always came along with these very optimistic ideas. That's the only way they could get it to balance. And of course, he knew it wouldn't happen. Never did. But I think, you see, if that happened, then you get a considerable boom. And just as you did under Reagan, which would be quite nice for the world economy, and it probably would lift commodity prices again. So that would be quite nice, actually, if that happened, at least for some time. So, although personally I would find it a very alarming result, it might turn out well for us in the ironic way these things sometimes do.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed both presentations a lot. Mr. Johnson, in the wake of the recent occurrence in the local elections that 3 major metros are now run by DA coalitions, what chances do you think there are that this phenomenon, this swing towards DA on the part of many black people, black voters especially, can become more than an urban phenomenon? Because if, I don't know whether I'm right in saying this, but I always had the impression that the growth of the MDC in Zimbabwe was mainly an urban phenomenon. But what you said earlier suggests that it surpassed, the figures, the percentages you mentioned, 2 MDC supporters for every 1 ZANU-PF supporter suggests that at least it had support in some of the rural areas as well. Now, do you think there's any growth possibility in South Africa for DA support beyond the urban areas?
Well, first of all, about Zimbabwe, of course, the MDC would get just about all the votes in Matabele, okay, for essentially ethnic reasons, given what Zimbabwe had done there. So, those were rural votes for a start. But you're quite right. look, ZANU-PF was rooted above all in Mashonaland, and there are Mashonaland East, Central, etc., you know, so that there are about 3 Mashonaland provinces. And there they didn't have any, they couldn't get in. But elsewhere, it would depend, you know, if they had a popular local person or something like that. But I think in South Africa, if you look rurally, I think that there are 2 things really which affect it, or 3. One is, I mean, if you go into most rural areas, there's really not much except the ANC. There's not really an organised party presence of other parties very much. Secondly, clearly ethnic factors matter. At the moment, quite clearly, there's a particular Zulu following for the ANC, which is predominant, and where, I mean, for example, if you look at those results, you'll see that in Maritzburg, the ANC vote went up. It's totally impervious to national trends, you know. Quite clearly there's an ethnic thing going on there. So, I mean, ethnicity matters, but secondly, or thirdly rather, chiefs. It's quite clear that the chiefs have been used, as the French call them, grand électeurs, where you do deals with them and then they try and ship their people into the voting booth in the way that you want. Now, that clearly works well in certainly large parts of the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. But of course the chieftaincy is not the same thing in all these areas. I mean, Zulu chieftaincy is much stronger than the chieftaincy you'll find among the Tswana, for example. You know, much more powerful, much more able to deliver the vote. So that it's quite striking that, and I mean, I don't think it's accidental that if you look at the vote in the northwest, which is the main Tswana area, obviously Marikana was a particular case. But the EFF did quite well in the whole province, actually. It did as well in Northwest as it did in Limpopo. Now, I can't help but think that's probably because the ANC is less able to use chieftaincy there than it would be in some other areas, you know. So I think it's these sort of factors that matter. But certainly, it's a very difficult situation for parties which are largely urban. And I mean, one shouldn't exaggerate. The DA did pick up extra black votes this time, but it's still a thin fringe. And they were, as I said before, they're more dependent on the EFF swiping a lot of ANC votes, really. But look, it's a challenge that parties definitely face. If they're going to move on from here, they've got to do something about it. But it's very difficult, because what are you going to do? You're going to go in and compete for the loyalty of the chiefs. I mean, you know, they get paid by the government, and the government's putting through legislation to favour them in various ways. Nonetheless, it's worth pointing out that even so, the ANC vote did fall a bit in rural areas as well. So, I mean, there was a swing vote there, even despite the lack of an opposition party presence and so on. You know, it's not totally controlled vote.
Hoe ernstig is die ANC om vir die Khoi en die San se nageslag restitusie te gee?
Ja, al die vraag hoor, daarachter.
Because ek het was 'n expert getuienis vir die boere in 'n saak in die ou Suurveld, onderkant Gramstad. En die minister, dink ek, het dit geïnstigeer, want sy familie het ook daar aanspraak gemaakt. En waar recht in die einde het ek gesê, maar die Khoi en die San het 'n veel groter aanspraak as die Xhosa op hierdie grond. En dit het die ding 'n bietjie die mekaar gemaak, die regter het nie gesê aan hierdie grond moet gaan.
Ja, dis 'n baie omstrede saak geweest, daardie veral toe nou blyk dat die minister se naam op die lys is.
Ek was 4 jaar spreker by die Khoisan Volkskongres in Swellendam. En hulle het ook vir Tony Ehrenreich daar gehad. En die groot keuse wat hulle daar moes maak is of hulle weer 'n kommersiële lyn wil volg in hulle grondaansprake en of hulle meer 'n populistiese lyn wil volg. En ek moet sê, die stadhoudheid, die koning en sy raad, hulle het op een ou na baie meer die kommersiële lyn probeer loop, maar daar was al die uit die Noord-Kaap uit, wat 'n meer populistiese aanslag gehad het. En Tony se saam daar in 'n baie sagte op hulle oor geval. Die ANC self sit regtig in 'n dilemma met die Khoisan. Daar's hierdie aanspraak op eerste nasie status en dieselfde disposisie waar ons in hierdie tipe van kongresse sit met swart eisers. Dieselfde disposisie sit die swart gemeenskappe met eisers van die Khoisan.
Was dat wel 'n uitspraak oor die Suurvan-saak, die Salling-saak?
Dis onder dis nou onder appel, nie?
Ja, maar dit is al 2-3 jaar omtrent.
Dis reg, want dit is ook 'n eis wat spruit uit iets wat gebeur het voor 1913. En aanvanklik het daardie regter gesê hy gaan die 1913 afsluitdatum ignoreer. Nou Agriesa het homself ook gevoeg as 'n party vir daai saak en sê dis nou 'n skrywende onderreg teenoor die grondwet eintlik wat 2013 vasbind. En die argument op die stadium is, selfs al is mense van hulle grond afgesit voor 1913, het hulle nasate nog sekere gebruiksregte uitgeoefen na 1913. Het sy as werkers of as bywoners, plaasplakkers en so.